this is a great picture. This is a picture I took in 2016. This is a Galapagos tortoise, a really big female. She was like, man, almost the size of a Volkswagen. She was humongous. You could ride her like a horse. Probably the coolest thing. It was just incredible. So, when you drive in Indiana, which I'm from, I'm not from Indiana, but I live in Indiana, right? You drive out into the country and you hit a pasture and you see what in that pasture? Eating grass. Cows, right? Yeah. There are no cows in the Galapagos. There are tortoises in the pastures eating the grass. It's wild, right? I mean, they don't have cows naturally on the island. Now, they brought cows. But these are the guys that fill that niche where cows or buffalo or some large mammal, right, has filled that niche in the Americas, North America in particular. Here, there were no mammals in that niche, and these little tortoises that came over that were probably like this big, right, which there are several species in South America that are about this size, obviously filled that gap and got big because they can eat. The bigger you are, the larger your digestive tract. The longer it is, the better you are at digesting cellulose and grasses. That they filled that niche of what a big hoofed animal fills here in the U.S. It's pretty neat. And they're very vocal. They're very loud. They grunt and groan and moan all the time. They're pretty interesting to be near. She was eating and she's giving me this stank eye because I was bothering her while she was eating, which I thought was funny. So we're going to talk about a little bit about how life first came about here on the planet, or how we think it has. Just before we jump into kind of how the fossil record records life on Earth and the diversity of life, I want to make sure we know the distinction between these two, micro versus macroevolution, right? So microevolution is kind of where we've been focusing on, right, so far. We've talked about evolution within a species or a population, and basically what that means is from generation to generation, phenotypes and genotypes change, right? They move around. We just talked about how they can directionally. It could be a directional versus disruptive versus stabilizing type of selection. A selection agent comes in and is removing some phenotypes while others stay around, right? That happens within populations. If populations become reproductively isolated by a barrier, for example, we called that allopatric speciation, if you remember. And now all of a sudden you separate two populations of the same species and they are experiencing different selection pressures, right? Then if that happens for a long period of time, they might build some reproductive barriers that prevent those two populations from interbreeding. We called those prezygotic and postzygotic barriers, didn't we? And those barriers build up as you accumulate microevolution events from selection agents. Those eventually can lead to changes above the species level, which we call macroevolution. And this is kind of what we're going to focus on, are the number of species that we see and the diversity across the planet and how that has changed over the life history of planet Earth. Now, sometimes macroevolution happens really slowly. It takes hundreds of millions of years. And sometimes it happens really fast. We call it a gradualism versus punctuated equilibrium, right? And with punctuated equilibrium, if you want it to happen fast, then you need some help, right? And sometimes help comes in the form of catastrophic events, like a major meteor or asteroid hitting the planet. So let's talk about how life arose, right? Life had to somehow form on the planet, however that was. The Earth formed, if you don't know, somewhere around 4.7 to 5 billion years ago, give or take 200,000 years, based on aging of rocks on the planet, the oldest rocks, and aging of moon rock, aging of asteroids and other meteors that have hit the planet. suggests that our solar system formed around this time, and all of the planets and the sun that we now rotate around the star that provides the light energy for our solar system, all formed around that time period. There was no life at that time. When the Earth first formed, it was molten rock. It had to cool. And then with all of the debris left over from the formation of our solar system, it was bombarded for hundreds of millions of years by frequent asteroid hits that kept the surface really hot and reformed the surface over and over and over and over again. Eventually, the surface of the Earth cooled and formed crust sitting on top of a very molten, energy-rich core, which is called the mantle. The first actual fossilized life that we can see under a microscope is about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years old. So for about a billion or more years, nothing was going on. That's a long period of time, right, of the Earth's history. And then the first life forms show up in the fossil record about, I think, closer to 3.5 million years ago, in my opinion. And they form in this kind of formation that's called a stromatolite. These are rocks that have been exposed after hundreds of millions of years along the coast of Australia. And when you take one of these weird-looking rock formations and you slice it with a saw in cross-section, really thin sections, it looks like layers of material have been laid down really tightly on top of one another, kind of like tree rings. You've cut through a tree before and saw tree rings. And what these layers represent are what are called biofilms. All right, they look a lot like biofilms. All right, and so what a biofilm is a thin layer of kind of mucousy, sticky material that bacteria produce, and they form mats of bacteria. You see this a lot on the, with cyanobacteria. If you've ever seen a kind of oil, slickish, very thick, gross layer on top of water, that's a biofilm. And the bacteria in there is called a cyanobacteria. It's kind of bluish green often. It's called a blue-green algae. And it produces this nasty kind of thick material that all the bacteria stick in and live in. It's kind of like their home. That's what a biofilm is. And that's what these stromatolites are, just biofilms on top of one another that the bacteria were alive at the surface, died, and then a new film was built on top of them. And so you got, all of these millions of years of biofilms that are made up of early prokaryotes, at least they look like bacteria, that were kind of dominating the surface of shallow waters, the floor of the ocean, if you will, which were very shallow at this time. The environment at this point was called a reducing environment. It was basically an environment that lacked oxygen. Okay, there was no oxygen in the environment. So there's no O2 in the early stages of when life first arose on the planet. So the atmosphere was made up of a lot of ammonia, methane, carbon dioxide, things that were spewed by hydrogen gas, things that were spewed by volcanoes. Volcanic activity was very active during this time period. So there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and these prokaryotes were all anaerobic. All right, so that made all of them anaerobic. So anaerobic means they did not use oxygen, right? They didn't need it. They don't use it. As a matter of fact, oxygen's toxic to them. Oxygen would kill them. Okay? So that's what you're seeing here is millions of years of prokaryotes. We're kind of the only thing kind of hanging out on the planet. Now the question is, from here to here, these guys just show up. From 4.7 billion to 3.5 billion years ago, there's nothing, and then all of a sudden there are bacteria, right? So how the heck did they form? That's the question, right? How did life just pop up? And that has obviously been a pondering question of science for hundreds of years, right? And so the universal answer at the moment is something that's called chemical evolution. So we're going to watch.
Stated Clearly presents, Can Science Explain the Origin of Life? A full scientific explanation for the origin of life does not currently exist, but research groups around the globe are tackling the mystery. Here we'll take a look at a few of their discoveries. Darwin's theory of biological evolution tells us that all life on Earth may have originated from a single, relatively simple reproducing creature living in the distant past. This idea is based on many observations, one of which is that when living things reproduce, children are often born with random new traits. Those with negative new traits are less likely to survive and reproduce. Those with positive new traits are more likely to survive and pass those traits on to their children. Over multiple generations, positive traits build up, allowing relatively simple life forms to evolve into complex life forms and even split into multiple different species. A careful look at the fossil record overwhelmingly confirms Darwin's theory. Life forms get simpler and simpler as we go back in time. The record suggests that all life on Earth emerged from primitive cellular colonies, which first appeared roughly 3.5 billion years ago. But how did those first reproducing creatures come about? Even the simplest bacteria alive today are far too complex to have popped into existence in a single step. Furthermore, the first reproducing creature could not have developed through biological evolution because biological evolution requires reproduction in order to work. The origin of life needs its own explanation. The most promising idea right now, the one which is consistently leading scientists to new discoveries, is the idea that life emerged from chemistry. Chemistry is the study of matter, particularly how atoms interact and combine to form molecules, and how those molecules interact and combine to form larger systems and structures. Everything is made of chemicals. The air we breathe, the ground we walk on, the shoes on our feet, even the feet inside our shoes. That said, the chemistry of life is special in two very important ways. First, the chemistry of life is organized into metabolic pathways. If you look at the cells of any living thing, even a plant which you wouldn't normally think of as being very lively, you discover a world of activity. Chemical reactions occur in continuous orderly paths, each reaction sparking the next. Scientists call these strange reactions metabolic pathways. The second oddity of life's chemistry is that living cells are made of special molecules. Building blocks like amino acids and sugars, which we once thought could not be found outside of life. These building blocks combine to form highly complex and orderly structures like genes, proteins, and cell membranes. In the past, scientists had no idea what powered the strange activities of life and produced its unique chemicals. They concluded that life must be fueled by a mysterious energy they called the vital force. In 1828, a chemist by the name of Frederick Wöhler accidentally produced urea in his lab. Urea is one of the main components of urine, one of many chemicals that the scientists of his time thought could only be produced by the vital force acting inside of a living creature. The artificial production of urea suggested that life might not be powered by a mysterious force, but instead is powered by normal chemical reactions which could be studied and understood. Since that time, numerous molecules and cellular activities have been recreated in the lab, clearly demonstrating that life is powered by normal chemical reactions and suggesting that life may have emerged from non-living chemistry. Researchers have recently discovered that many of the building blocks of life, amino acids and sugars, exist inside of meteorites, rocks which have fallen to the Earth from outer space. This tells us that these special molecules are being produced spontaneously all throughout our solar system and may have been common on the ancient Earth. We've also discovered a process now referred to as chemical evolution. When simple molecules are left alone with an energy source, they interact with one another, often forming larger, more complex molecules as time goes on. Experiments in the lab have shown that chains of chemical reactions can develop, some of which resemble the metabolic pathways of life. Surprisingly, we've also found that certain molecules have the remarkable ability to self-assemble into complex, orderly structures. Some self-assemble into hollow spheres, almost identical to the membranes of modern living cells. Others self-assemble into long columns, remarkably similar to the strands of DNA found in life. Scientists still have many questions to answer about life's origins. How did different types of molecules first start working together, eventually producing the genetic code? What were the original reproducing creatures actually like? Were they similar to the cells we have today, or were they something much simpler? And finally, possibly the most interesting question of all, how likely is it that life has formed or is forming in other regions of our galaxy? So, back to the original question, can science explain the origin of life? Science has not explained the origin of life in full detail, but researchers are building a theory intended to one day describe, start to finish, how basic chemistry can give rise to living cells. I'm John Perry, and that's the origin of life, as we understand it so far, stated clearly.
Okay, so this process that he's describing in that video is called abiogenesis. So it's the synthetic of small organic compounds or molecules from inorganic molecules. So remember, what's an organic compound? It's a compound that contains what? Carbon and hydrogen, right, at least. Right? And so there weren't a lot of that around sitting within the environment that early life developed in, because it's a reducing environment. There's no oxygen, and there's a lot of ammonia. There's a lot of methane, CH3, right, which is kind of a very basic organic compound. These are produced by volcanoes. All right, they're produced by volcanic activity, and other processes that happen on the planet. But this reducing environment, in combination with the shallow warm Earth, was called the primordial soup. So there are these two fellows, O'Parent and Haldane, who came up with the hypothesis in the early 1920s after they discovered you can make things like urea in a test tube, and it's not the vital force that's controlling life. It might be chemical reactions. They suggested that the early Earth and the shallow oceans, this reducing environment, with a little help like volcanic heat or electricity in particular from lightning, could create small organic molecules from small inorganic resources. They had no way to test it at that time in the 20s. In the 50s, Miller and Urey came up with the Miller-Urey experiment, where they built this apparatus that looks kind of like this, where they have a saline solution that mimics the ocean and a bunch of compounds like methane and ammonia and hydrogen, maybe some carbon dioxide that are representative of the atmosphere. And with heated water, say from a volcano or a lightning strike, which would have thrown water vapor into the air, if you mix those things with a little electricity from lightning and then collect that water vapor after you've exposed it to the chemicals in lightning using a condenser, and then collected that water and sampled it for its chemical analysis, you find lots of small organic molecules. And some are very amino acid-like. So they could produce organic molecules using this system artificially, which represented, the early Earth and the environment of the early Earth. They've also done it in an oxidizing environment, which means that there was actually some oxygen and some other oxidizing molecules like carbon dioxide. Because some scientists say that it wasn't a reducing environment, that there was actually an alkaline or an oxidizing environment that was that represented the early Earth. But you can still do the same process with more oxidizing agents that would take up electrons and protons, and you still get organic molecules that are formed. So they came up with this hypothesis called the abiogenic hypothesis, that life began from natural chemistry. All right? Once you get some of these organic molecules formed, then they will line themselves up and undergo organization, where some of the smaller molecules become bigger ones. And that process of self-building into a puzzle-like structure is called polymerization. All right, and a lot of our major macromolecules, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, they polymerize when you put them in water. And these molecules will do that also. Now, there's a natural example of this that we have found now that we have deep submersibles that can go to the bottom of the ocean and are mapping the ocean out. These are called hydrothermal vents. They form near where two of our plates that make up the continents merge or form. They're called faults, and these are called hydrothermal vents. And they are found on the ocean floor, really deep in the ocean, and they are an oasis, if you will, of life in that area. That is, a lot of life is concentrated around these thermal vents. And that's because the thermal vents give off a lot of these same molecules that mix with salt water and extreme heat from the mantle. So it's heat that's the energy source here, not lightning. And they start producing organic molecules that life can start using. And so a lot of primitive life is concentrated around these thermal vents. And some scientists say maybe life not only formed because of something similar to this in the atmosphere, but maybe it was hydrothermal vents that also played a major role in the production of life through abiogenesis. And then most biologists now deem that some of the amino acids in particular could have come from extraterrestrial sources, because meteorites, which have been collected, that have hit the planet, you break them open and you can find amino acids in them. All right? All the major amino acids have been found extraterrestrially also, which suggests that this is not uncommon across our solar system, that these types of things happen in other places. Now, these experiments have been done over and over and over again, and in the early 2000s, I believe, I'll try to get the exact date, I'll look up the paper. There was a group who added one piece to this puzzle that's a little different than what Miller and Urey did. They actually added clay, an ash clay, which is made of volcanic ash, which would have been spewed from volcanic activity at this time, to this soup, if you will. And the ash, what the ash does is provide a workbench that concentrates these little organic molecules and allows the formation of membranes, right, much more readily. And that was one of the major things that were missing from the Miller-Urey experiments was, what about the cell membrane, right? You need a cell membrane or a boundary or barrier that separates the intracellular or cytoplasm from the extracellular environment. And membranes or membrane-like structures, which they often term protocells, form when ash and clay, volcanic ash in particular, is added to this apparatus. And you form these kinds of frothy, bubbly material, which are these amphipathic molecules kind of forming into vesicles, right? Small and large vesicles, which could represent cell membranes. The other thing that forms much more readily with ash, with this volcanic ash, is RNA. Okay, so RNA, or something very similar to RNA, forms pretty readily and is probably our original genetic code holder was RNA, right? RNA, the other thing that's really, really interesting about RNA is, and I haven't really told you much about RNA besides that we know it carries messages, it makes up ribosomal RNA, right? Makes up transfer RNA. We often call it single-stranded, don't we? RNA. But RNA can fold on itself and hydrogen bond and form very specific three-dimensional structures. And when you can do that, you can start to form enzymes, right? So proteins didn't have to be our original enzyme kind of mechanism to run metabolism or basic metabolism. It could have been RNAs, which are easier to form. And they're called ribozymes. And ribozymes are RNAs that have the ability to do enzyme work or to run basic chemistry. So that's a little introduction to at least how we universally believe or hypothesize, right, that early life could have arisen on the planet. Once you get those prokaryotes in place and they're reproducing, right, and producing these stromatolites, then that sets the stage for evolution to occur, right, based on selection pressures. And that's where the fossil record comes in, right, to give us kind of a record, if you will, right, of life on the planet during Earth's history. Now, the problem with the fossil record is it's really, really biased, and every biologist should point that out immediately. It's very biased, incredibly biased. It's incredibly incomplete. It's like a bunch of photographs, right? I mean, you can take a picture of a sequence of events, and the photo never tells the entire story, does it? Right? Same thing here with fossils. It's very biased in the sense that only organisms that are hard-bodied or have some hard component to their body will fossilize. They have to die in the right sediment, in the right place, so that, you know, they're buried quickly by sediments, and then those sediments are hardened into rock. Once they're in that sediment, then that area can't be affected by geologic processes until the fossils are produced. I mean, it's really hard to find anywhere on the planet where rock layers weren't affected by some geologic event. And typically the organisms that are fossilized were really abundant and around on the planet for a really long time, which makes them much higher probability that they were fossilized, right, than something that was rare and not found for very long on the planet. So understanding that, or making those assumptions, we know that it is an incomplete and biased record at best, and we're missing lots of fossils, right? Also, all the fossils within Earth's crust have not been found yet. So there are lots of new fossils found every year. And all you have to do is read the scientific literature and you find, you know, new dinosaurs or new fossils. So we're adding to the fossil record all the time. But as the video said, as you go from young rock to deeper, older rock, life does get simpler and less complex as you go down. And we age those rocks based on mathematics and the degradation of what we call radioactive elements, right? And so younger fossils can be carbon dated. Anything from like 60 to 80,000 years ago can be carbon dated. Anything older than that, you actually have to radio date the rock that the fossil's in, and you have to use other radioactive materials that have much longer, what are called half-lives. Okay? And we'll start with this slide next time, because this is a little video on what radiometric dating is and how half-life works.
How do we know how old something is? For people, we'd ask to see their birth certificate. For trees, we'd count the rings. But how do we know how old a fossil is? Fossils have their own internal clock. Scientists can read it by looking at the ratio of two different types of carbon atoms. Of course, every living thing is made of carbon. Plants grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use it to form complex organic molecules. Animals get their carbon by eating these plants. But there's more than one form of carbon. Most carbon atoms have 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We call this carbon-12. High up in the atmosphere, sometimes cosmic rays hit nitrogen atoms. This creates carbon with 6 protons and 8 neutrons. We call this carbon-14. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 behave alike, but carbon-14 has one unique and important attribute. It's unstable. So once an animal dies, the carbon-14 in its body will start to go away. Every 5,730 years on average, about half of the carbon-14 atoms will decay into nitrogen. This is its half-life. After one half-life, the animal will have about half the amount of carbon-14 it started with. After another half-life, it will have about a quarter. And after another half-life, it will have about an eighth. By contrast, the amount of carbon-12 it has in its body will stay the same. By measuring the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, we can measure how many thousands of years have passed since the animal died. Carbon dating works for fossils up to about 60,000 years old. For older fossils, scientists use unstable elements that have much longer half-lives. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Michael Moyer.
History of life, right, on planet Earth, using Earth's history and then the fossil record to look at the major macroevolutionary events. These are global evolutionary events, right? So big, huge events that happened on planet Earth. And there are basically 6 of these, right? 6 of these on your slides, the major 6 that I like at least. And then we'll talk about the events globally that kind of lead to these huge global macroevolutionary events. You could also call these major speciation events, right? Where you get lots of new species or see lots of speciation or extinctions if we're talking about a catastrophic event that kills lots of life on Earth. So the first major life or biological event that happened on planet Earth happened about 3.5 billion years ago. Before this, the planet was either too hostile or under a lot of volcanic or meteorite or asteroid bombarding that would keep life from forming. But we talked last time, I know it was after break, before break, and I know it's after break, but before, we talked a lot about the chemical revolution, right? How chemistry may have given risen to life, or at least the first single-celled organisms. And the first single-celled organisms that we see are actually prokaryote ancestors. So, we see those in rock formations like this one here in Australia. There are a couple places in the world where erosion has taken us down to the right rock layer, which is about 3.5 billion years old. And you start to see these round structures that are basically cemented and fossilized mats of prokaryotes. And so a lot of prokaryotes, at least today, when they are living together, they produce a gelatinous kind of thin mat that floats, that they live in aqueous environments, that they kind of use as their home or where they reside and how they communicate with one another. And these biological films, is what they call them, or biofilms, are what these rocks are made up of. So if you take these stromatolites and you actually section really thin sections of rock with a very fine saw, what you'll see is what looks like tree rings almost, or layer upon layer of these bacteria mats, well, prokaryote ancestor mats that basically have prokaryotes in them. And there are a number of different species that they've kind of ID'd or and given names to. Some of them are very cyanobacteria-like towards the end of the stromatolite, or the youngest of the stromatolite formations. So these single-celled organisms lived in a planet that was, like we mentioned before, is a reducing environment. There was very little oxygen, lots of methane, lots of carbon dioxide, and lots of other elements and molecules that are volcanic in origin that made up most of the atmosphere. And so their metabolism was anaerobic, right? That is their metabolism to make energy, use carbon sources and sometimes non-carbon sources without oxygen to make their ATP energy. Until the adaptation, which was probably a group of mutations that led to some of these prokaryotes being able to utilize carbon dioxide in the sun to produce oxygen. Yep.
I'm sorry, I might have missed it when you said, but what are stromatolites?
Those are the rocks, those rock formations that look like trees when you cut them into pieces, which are cemented layers of biofilms of bacteria or bacteria-like organisms that are prokaryotes. And they are old. They're like 3.5 billion years old. Now, the first cyanobacteria-like prokaryotes arose, at least in the fossil record, about 2.7 billion years ago. And they started using sunlight. So they would capture sunlight and make carbohydrates out of it that they could use to make their ATP. And a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, right? And so oxygen is your first major poison or toxin, if you will. And it's going to basically cause one of the first major extinction events on planet Earth. It's going to kill most of those anaerobic prokaryotes because oxygen they couldn't use, and it was actually a poison. It shut down their metabolism. And you can see here on this figure, it kind of shows oxygen concentrations were very low from 4 billion years ago up to about 2.7, and then all of a sudden the atmosphere gets filled or spikes with this huge atmospheric oxygen concentration that then levels off for a long period of time and then spikes again with the evolution of other algae and land plants. So this is considered one of the first toxins or poisons and causes one of the first major extinction events, particularly of the anaerobic bacteria that were dominant before the cyanobacteria arose. Now, what this is going to do is also something called supercooling. So you can imagine all across the planet in these shallow oceans, these cyanobacteria took over, right? I mean, they can photosynthesize, they can make lots of energy, they can grow fast, reproduce quickly, and start out competing all of these anaerobic bacteria, which are also being killed off by the oxygen revolution. What this is going to do is remove all the carbon dioxide and methane out of the atmosphere because they use those carbon sources to make sugar, right? And they're replacing it with oxygen. And if you know anything about carbon dioxide and methane, mostly carbon dioxide today, it makes up our greenhouse gas layer that insulates the Earth, right? Keeps the Earth warm. So with the removal of most of the carbon dioxide and atmospheric methane, the Earth starts to cool. And once it gets to a certain, distance from the sun, it supercools the Earth, and the Earth undergoes its first major global glaciation event, which kills most life on the planet. So all because of biology, right? So all because of oxygen. So I have a little video on that.
The Earth circles the Sun, but this orbit is unstable. Over hundreds of thousands of years, it changes, swinging the planet further out into space and pivoting on its axis. At the furthest point in its orbit, and with the northern hemisphere tilted away from the Sun, the Earth cools. 2.4 billion years ago, something turns this natural cooling into a global catastrophe. It is one of the most dangerous things in all the universe. Life. Tiny organisms populate the oceans. There's no oxygen around, and that's the way most of them like it. But then, a new kind of bacteria evolves. Cyanobacteria. And these guys create a serious gas problem.
Imagine Earth billions of years ago. There's no oxygen. Everybody's happy. Then cyanobacteria start making oxygen. It's a toxic pollutant. If there was a regulatory agency at the time, they would have been outlawed. Eventually, they polluted the whole world. They had really precipitated an ecological crisis of global proportions.
The great oxygen crisis upsets the greenhouse effect that keeps the planet warm. And with the Earth at its furthest point from the sun, global temperatures plummet.
The ultimate culprit is biology. Biology makes a mess of the planet, produces oxygen. The oxygen destroys the greenhouse effect of methane, and that freezes up the Earth.
2.4 billion years ago, ice creeps out from the poles. Instead of warming the planet, sunlight bounces off the ice. Temperatures fall, creating more ice, which bounces more sunlight back into space. And so on, until the cooling becomes unstoppable. The ice marches on. Temperatures plunge to an average of minus 74 degrees. The blue planet turns white. It's a snowball Earth. And incredibly, this may have happened not once, but at least 3 times over the following billion years as the planet lurched around the sun. But throughout all of this, and against all the odds, a handful of species clung to life. Thanks to volcanoes.
Even in an Earth that was covered almost entirely by ice, volcanoes would have been punching through that. So you'd certainly have pockets of water lying about. Then life was able to carry on and get through these cold periods.
And the whole time, the volcanoes that help sustain life have been pumping out carbon dioxide. As this greenhouse gas increases, the atmosphere warms, until 640 million years ago, the last great snowball Earth ends. And the survivors emerge into a new world.
Right, so that back and forth between supercooling and warming had to do a lot with the ability to do photosynthesis. Eventually the Earth unthaws, and you don't see a major global supercooling event like that for a long time. From the prokaryotes, the first eukaryotes are going to form about 1.8 billion years ago. At least that's the first fossils that we have. The oldest fossils that we have of the first eukaryotes are from that time period. And we know that they have risen because of endosymbiotic theory, right? This video here is the TED Talk that you guys watched earlier that talks about endosymbiotic theory. And we've seen this real time now, right? I would giving you a great example of a nitroplast that would, if you remember when we talked about endosymbiotic theory earlier, when we went through cells, that is now becoming pretty common in the plankton that we see today. So this is something that happens probably quite often during life's history, particularly early in the evolution of biological specimens like prokaryotes and early eukaryotes, where a larger prokaryote swallows a smaller one, right? And the smaller ones that are the ones that are going to persist inside the cytoplasm are those that can use oxygen, right? And use it to metabolize carbohydrates. We call them mitochondria now. And those that can capture light, correct, to do photosynthesis. And that gives you your first kind of pioneering organelles that are compartmentalized areas that are living inside of the cytoplasm of another prokaryote. So these events, these endosymbiotic events, would have led to selection for those particular types of compartments, which would lead to more and more complicated eukaryotes. So you can watch the TED Talk video again. I'm going to skip it here so I don't bore you too badly, because I got other videos I want you to watch as we go through this lecture. So, of course, after you establish eukaryotes, you can imagine a lot of them are complex and better adapted to the environment that they are living in, the aquatic environment at this point, mostly marine, that those eukaryotes spread and diversified to fill niches in these shallow ocean environments. Eventually, many of those cells start to aggregate together and form multicellular organisms that start becoming very common in the fossil record as you move from 1.8 to 1.2 billion years ago. A lot of these, particularly later in their evolution, towards the climax of their evolution, form a lot of similar primitive multicellular organisms that look a lot like sponges and soft corals and even plant-like organisms that are photosynthetic. But there aren't true plants or real plants at this point. This biota that is living pretty much on the ocean floor is called the Ediacaran biota, based on when it appeared. And as the Earth thawed out and these organisms became more common, it's going to lead to even more specialization and diversification of multicellular organisms. Most of this biota here are grazers, filter feeders, and scavengers, because they don't have real mouths, and a lot of them don't swim really well or move very well. So they're, and a lot of them are photosynthesizing, right, if they're plant-like. And plant-like organisms, the algae, if you will, these ancestral algae, are what everybody's feeding on, right, the photosynthetic organisms. And they're called grazers because they eat those plants, or filter feeders because they remove algae or other organic material from the water, or they're scavengers that eat, any of the organisms that die at this point. No real predators, or what look like predators, are found in this biota. Now, about 500 million years ago, you get this explosion of fossils that show up in the fossil record across the planet. That's called the Cambrian explosion. And it is because of a number of probably mutations to developmental genes that allowed for the development of polarity to the body, that is front and back, right? Head versus tail. And then the development of muscle tissue and the development of a cord in the back of the body that's called the notochord, that eventually is going to give rise to the vertebrate line. But this is going to be the explosion of predators, right? The evolution of predation. These predators now start to develop morphology in the head region that is bizarre, but gives the ability of a lot of these predators to eat all of that eukaryotic biota that's been sitting around for the last 300 or 400 million years. And this predation allows predators to fill all of the niches that are available to predators. And they start to, basically push all the Ediacaran biota to extinction. All the major animal and plant taxa arise out of this explosion, these two explosive events. And so after this 525 million years, or 500 million years really, you can look into the fossil record and find all the major animal taxa and plant, or at least aquatic plant taxa, and algae at this point that you see today. Vertebrates also arise out of this explosion in the form of a group of organisms that we're going to call chordates eventually when we do biodiversity. This is kind of representatives, these two back here swimming, or eel-like, of ancestral chordate that is eventually going to give rise to the vertebrate line, which we are part of. Of course, all of this happened in the water, right? So the last key macroevolutionary event here that I'm going to at least talk about is it gets really crowded in the water, right, during all these major macroevolutionary events. So organisms that could actually move into a new niche, that would be something that would be allow for diversification of that group. And the first animals to do that, to make the jump from water to land, whether it's marine or fresh, there's lots of arguments over it, are the arthropods, all right, particularly the arachnids, which are the oldest group of arthropods. So think of horseshoe crabs, right? Have you guys all seen videos or maybe even saw a horseshoe crab in the tidal pool? So those guys, what they have is a lot of armor, exoskeleton that can support their body weight. So you can throw, a horseshoe crab onto the sand and it can move, right? Very well, because it can support its body weight. It has bunches of appendages. That exoskeleton made of chitin, it would allow these organisms to make that jump from water to land pretty quickly. Eventually, gills would have to be replaced with lungs or skin or some other type of gill that allows them to extract oxygen from air. But it's not surprising that the arthropods, which have a very unique respiratory system anyway, it's a series of tubes that allow them to extract oxygen from the air, are the ones that make the jump. Scorpion-like organisms arise very quickly and start to dominate the land environment about anywhere between 500 and 400 million years ago. Also, the first land plants arise during this time and start spreading out across the terrestrial environment. The really interesting thing about these fossils, when you look at the plants, almost all of them have a symbiotic association with fungi. All right, so fungi actually came with the plants because these algae ancestors weren't true plants, right? Weren't true what we would consider terrestrial plants. They didn't have any roots. They had nothing to anchor them in the soil and nothing to extract water and nutrients from the soil. That's where the fungi come in. Fungi have long filamentous body parts that they call hyphae that have tremendous surface area and would have been able to provide these early plants with very poor root systems with the ability to remove nutrients and water from the soils. Any plant that you pull out of the soil today still has fungi associated with it that help with root efficiency, if you will, with extracting nutrients and water from the soil. And we'll talk about the group. They're called mycorrhizal fungi that actually do this when we start talking about our run through animal and plant diversity. So those are kind of the 6 major macroevolutionary events, at least that I'm going to go through. There are obviously a bunch of others, but those are the ones that really move us to life as we know it on the planet today. These large speciation events, which we call adaptive radiation events, as you'll see in one of the last slides, occur because of major global scale events like asteroids or meteors hitting, or volcanic activity, or glaciation. Yeah. What are you doing, man?
I'm looking to see if the salamander stuff is with the whale stuff.
It's not. I think it's downstairs in the. At least I think that's what Mary's.
There's some cool
students.
videos of this, you guys. It's fun to watch, and you get lost watching the continents move around.
Oh yeah, I have 2 videos in here. Yeah.
Pretty cool.
So plate tectonics is one of them. Dr. Sweets, by the way, if you want to know. So plate tectonics is the first major global scale event that can cause mass extinction or evolutionary events on the planet. And plate tectonics is one of them. As we've already mentioned and talked about a little bit, this theory revolves around that the core of the Earth is hot, which produces a kind of liquid rock layer called the mantle. And then we have a lithosphere or a crust on the surface that is hard. It's rock. It's a certain width and mileage across the surface of the planet. And it's broken into plates, right? This hard rock. And these plates float around on the mantle and they move. And they move a few centimeters a year because new crust, if you will, is added at certain points across the planet. And I'll show you a video that kind of explains how plate tectonics works here in a minute in a very simple way. But these plates house the continents. The continents house the terrestrial environment, right, that we live in. And they're moving around constantly. And so this is a timeline on Earth that shows Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic periods from 250 to 45 million years ago to present. This is obviously what the planet, how these plates look today, or how the continents look today, right? The ones you're familiar with. If you go back a little bit in time, it's almost the same thing, right? But you have land bridges in certain areas. Like there was a land bridge between South America and Antarctica and Australia. land bridge between North America and Eurasia. But if you go far enough back, about 250 million years ago, then all of the continents were actually together as the plates all touched in a certain way. And this formed this large supercontinent that ran from north to south kind of in a C shape. And you had basically a large landmass close to the North Pole, large land masses close to the South Pole, and then you had obviously land masses close to the equator. This gave you a huge variation in temperature, right, across the terrestrial environments, with it being really cold at the poles and warmer near the equator. But it also gave you pretty much the largest landmass where there is an ocean, right? The interior was huge and was dry and relatively cool at this time. And so that really affected, the evolution of animals and plants. Of course, they start to separate, right? And if you think about this, this means migration can happen across this large continent, right? This large landmass, if organisms can tolerate ranges of temperature. So there's a lot of migration going on and a lot of movement of organisms across this supercontinent. But eventually they start to re-separate, and the ocean will fill in the gaps between them, as you can see, as you move upward. And that is going to form separation of the continents and trap organisms on certain land masses. And then that gives you immediate reproductive isolation, right? What we call allopatric speciation, which led to major speciation and adaptive radiation on these different continents. Also, some of them would migrate north, some of them stayed on the equator, some of them migrated south, right? And that's going to change which organisms can survive and not survive on those land masses. So, a lot of dinosaur evolution happens right here, right? So if you follow dinosaurs, I loved dinosaurs as a kid, but if you follow their evolution, because they're around a long time, they are, their evolution starts to be here in the Mesozoic when you start seeing the primitive dinosaurs, where there's lots of land mass and the planet's pretty warm. A lot of the land mass, as you can see, is pretty close to the equator. And as their evolution moves towards this boundary right here where we lose all the dinosaurs, you can see that the continents separate and the evolution of dinosaurs becomes pretty extreme as you have a lot of adaptive radiation happening across these continents where there's major temperature differences, right? The Earth is really cooling terrestrially as you move north and south. Of course, dinosaurs would have continued to evolve into whatever they would have evolved into, except for a major catastrophic event that happened about 65 million years ago. So plate tectonics is one major global player in evolution at a macroscopic level across the globe.
Are you sure this thing is rated for this depth? You bought it from an air mall catalog. Oh, great. Dear Tim and Moby, when I look at a map, it seems like some continents fit together perfectly. Are my eyes playing tricks on me? From Georgia. You're not seeing things, Georgia. Some continents look exactly like puzzle pieces that snap together. Early map makers suspected that they were once all connected. In the early 20th century, a scientist named Alfred Wegener called this supercontinent Pangaea. He thought different chunks of it broke off and slowly moved apart. Over millions of years, they formed the continents we know today. Wegener couldn't explain why Pangaea split up or how. But there was some evidence to support his idea. Fossils from similar plants and animals had been found oceans apart. The age and type of rock layers matched up too. Wegener's theory of continental drift provided an explanation, but his ideas weren't taken seriously until long after he died. In the 1950s, scientists began mapping the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's a mountain range running 10,000 miles along the ocean floor. Tests revealed that the farther you got from the ridge, the older the seafloor was. So a geologist named Harry Hess proposed a revolutionary idea. New seafloor was forming at the ridge and spreading outward to make room for more. In other words, the surface of the planet was moving. Hess called this process seafloor spreading. It seemed to indicate that rock was being forced up from inside the planet. Nowadays, we can see this rock formation in action. Wegener had guessed something like this, but he had no way to prove it at the time. As he suspected, there's a lot going on beneath the Earth's surface. Up here, everything seems pretty cool and stable. But miles below our feet, it's a raging inferno. The deeper you go, the hotter it gets. Earth's center, or core, is as scorching as the surface of the sun. All that energy wants to escape like steam inside a boiling kettle. It pushes outward, putting immense pressure on the middle section, the mantle. Standing in its way is the lithosphere, a rigid layer of solid rock. Well, the lithosphere isn't like a smooth shell. It's cracked into pieces, each one a different shape, size, and thickness. We call those pieces plates. Yep, the mid-Atlantic ridge is the border between several plates. They're being dragged apart by forces from deep inside the planet. You can think of it like a pot of soup. The Earth's core is the burner, and the mantle is the boiling soup. As the soup near the burner heats up, it becomes less dense and rises. When it gets to the top, it cools off and sinks down toward the heat. In physics, those are called convection currents. A similar process is driving the mantle, and it's taking the plates along for the ride. That movement is called plate tectonics. It's the engine driving the constant transformation of our planet's surface. Plates have been bouncing off each other for eons. The oceans have expanded and contracted. Land masses have smashed into each other and broken apart. The plates move about as fast as your fingernails grow, so we don't see the ground sliding around under our feet, but we do sometimes feel it. Yep, I'm talking about earthquakes. Seismic activity is greatest along plate borders. At convergent boundaries where two plates collide, at divergent boundaries where they pull apart, and at transform boundaries where they slide past each other. At all three boundaries, there's enormous pressure on the Earth's crust. That's the topmost layer of the lithosphere. The pressure can build up for years. The longer it takes to release, the bigger the earthquake. Yep, and plate movement drives volcanic activity too. At divergent boundaries like the mid-Atlantic ridge, there's a gap in the lithosphere. So magma, molten rock from the mantle, is constantly pushing up along the boundaries. These are the most volcanically active places on Earth. Volcanoes are also common at boundaries called subduction zones. That's when a dense ocean plate converges with a lighter continental plate. The heavier plate gets pushed below, down into the mantle. Some of it melts, and the magma erupts farther inland. The Ring of Fire is a massive chain of these volcanoes. Dense sedimentary rock making up the Pacific seafloor is subducted, transformed into metamorphic rock through pressure and heat, and then recycled as igneous rock through volcanic eruptions. In other words, plate tectonics drives the rock cycle, the constant process of transformation and renewal of the Earth's crust. It also creates our most prominent geologic features, mountain ranges. That happens when two continental plates converge. Since they're both about the same density, neither one subducts. Instead, it's like a slow-motion car crash. The plates buckle and warp. The land pushes up into jagged peaks. The Himalayas are still growing from a plate collision that began 500 million years ago. Yeah, Alfred Wegener's theory has come a long way in 100 years. He was practically laughed out of the scientific community for his ideas. But today, plate tectonics is the unifying theory that ties together the entire field of geology. What do you mean, out of juice? We're stuck here? Now what? Oh, thank you.
So that gives you a little bit of information about plate tectonics. There's also a video right after that that's just a video showing you how an animation of how the continents have moved. So I'll save that one from you. You can watch that one on your own if you want to. All right, so that's number one. Plate tectonics leads to these macroevolutionary speciation events. Mass extinction also happens relatively often in Earth's history. There are lots of extinction events, but there are 5 mass extinction events in the last 500 million years. And these mass extinction events are important because they remove groups of organisms from niches or ecological roles or levels within the environment and allow for speciation to happen. Mass extinction events across the globe happen because of catastrophic global events that change the environment so dramatically that organisms don't have time to adapt. What's really, really interesting is it's been estimated that 99.9% of all species that have ever been on the planet are extinct. So only a small bit of life is that, if you think about life overall across the entire planet's life history, there's only a small percentage of it that's ever alive or living at any one time. So this is what these mass extinction events look like across the last 500 million years. So here, 500 million years ago, during the Paleozoic, and then so you got 3 major life period or Earth periods here. You have Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. This is today. And you can see that if you count the big ones, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So of the 5, I'm really going to just talk about these 2 here. The largest one ever, which is called the Permian extinction. And it is the one that has killed the most species in about a 500 million year period. 500,000 year period, sorry. And it was because of a huge volcanic activity that happened in what is present-day Siberia. And I guess the volcano was large enough that, or a number of eruptions was large enough that the lava flow covered hundreds and thousands of kilometers across Europe. And the lava was, hundreds of kilometers deep and killed a lot of the land life or terrestrial life in that area, about 70% of land life. And about 95% of all marine life was killed in that 500,000 year period. The reason for this is because not only at ground zero where you evaporated, right, or you just died because of mass heat, but these volcanic eruptions spewed lots of carbon dioxide and methane into the air. So much so that the carbon dioxide layer thickened quite large and changed the surface temperature of the planet by 6 to 7 degrees, which would kill a lot of temperature-sensitive organisms. This carbon dioxide that was spewed into the atmosphere would also mix with salt water, since most aquatic life was in the marine environment. And when you mix carbon dioxide with water, it forms an acid called carbonic acid. And that would lower the pH of the ocean. It's called acidification. It's what we're doing to the oceans now, is acidifying them slowly. This acidification would have been massive. And dropping the pH of the ocean, which is typically basic, would have killed a lot of marine life that way. So all that death within the ocean would have also caused a large amount of nutrients to be released, which would allow for prokaryotic booms, growth by decomposition, that would have used up all the oxygen in those oceans also, which would have killed a lot of marine life. So that's called the Permian extinction, the largest extinction of animals at one time within the last 500,000 years. The other one happens at that 65.5 million year boundary between what's called the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods. The Cretaceous can be spelled with a K or a C, and then the Tertiary period is that first period there of the Cenozoic era. This is the line in the fossil record. If you go to older rock, like 70 million years, 80 million years ago, it's full of dinosaurs. Lots of dinosaur diversity at that time. The climax of dinosaur diversity happens during the late Mesozoic era. And then if you go past that line to like 60 or 50 million years ago, there are no dinosaurs at all. So you go from lots of dinosaurs to no dinosaurs. And so this huge catastrophic event removed all the dinosaurs from the planet, except for birds. All right, birds are dinosaurs or direct descendants of dinosaurs. Many plants and other animal species also died during this catastrophic event. Now, this catastrophic event is most likely a really large asteroid that hit the planet right off the coast of Mexico, where the Yucatan Peninsula is. And you read it could be anywhere from 1 mile to 5 miles wide. It struck the planet there. There is a crater, a half crater under the ocean that's been mapped out just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula that fits really nicely with all the sciotos and underground caves that make up the land mass of the Yucatan Peninsula. It forms this huge crater where the asteroid probably hit. The other piece of evidence that's quite telling is if you look at the rock across the planet at 65.5 million years, there are several compounds that are found in that rock that are not common on planet Earth. They are common in meteorites and moon rock. So an extraterrestrial source of dust, if you will, is found across the planet at this time globally. So what that suggests is when the asteroid hit and was vaporized as it hit the planet, all of that debris was launched, all that dust was launched into the atmosphere and basically blocked the sun out, providing for something pretty close to a nuclear winter, lowering temperatures globally and killing a lot of plant life. Therefore, all those large dinosaurs, as you've seen, pictures, videos, movies of, particularly the herbivores that had nothing to eat, they died off. The predators ate them for a while, right, as scavengers, but they eventually ran out of food sources too and died off, leaving a bunch of terrestrial niches open because they were dominated by dinosaurs. There was a group of animals that were ready to fill those niches, fill those ecological roles that dinosaurs held. They're called mammals, right? And so mammals were not very diverse at this time and small and unassuming, and they started to fill in all of those open niches. When a catastrophic event like this happens, it leads to adaptive radiation because you open up a lot of ecological areas or levels or roles that are called niches or niches, if you want to use that pronunciation. So a niche for us right now is an ecological role. It's a role that can be filled by an organism to utilize that role or area or level of the ecological realm to survive, map out their life, and reproduce. So at the time that meteor hit, dinosaurs had filled all the niches, right? That large asteroid hit. And mammals were small and trying to just make their way through life, occupying several lower niches. Once the dinosaurs died, all the terrestrial niches opened up and mammals were set, ready to fill those niches. And that's why we are kind of at the climax, if you will, now of mammal evolution, right, on the planet. Imagine if that meteor didn't hit. Mammals may not have ever evolved into the group that they are. And that would have led to our evolution also. So we're going to talk a lot about niches when we get to ecology. Another place where you see, a lot of niche resourcing or a lot of niche partitioning and animals filling niches causing adaptive radiation are on islands, like we've mentioned many times. If a volcano produces a new island out in the middle of the ocean, that's going to open up new terrestrial niches, right, that animals can take advantage of, and they will diversify or radiate into a bunch of new species quickly. And that's what adaptive radiation is. It's major speciation that happens, and when it happens globally, it's because of a major catastrophic event. So, adaptive radiation events that cause major macroevolution across the planet have occurred after every mass extinction. Here are three really good examples. Again, after the dinosaurs died out, mammals started to radiate and fill niches about 65 million years ago and have continued that radiation and evolution into present day. When land plants left the water, this allowed for major speciation of the animals that were living on the planet, that on the terrestrial environment at that time, particularly the arachnids and arthropods, which were the first land organisms that are animal-based. This is why arthropods still dominate our environment, insects, right? They're annoying when you're outside in the summer sometimes, like mosquitoes and others. But there are so many arthropods in the terrestrial environment because they were the first to actually make that jump from water to land. One major insect type of adaptive radiation event happened when land plants evolved flowers. Flowers evolved to form symbiotic relationships with insects because insects pollinate flowers, don't they? Or at least a lot of flowers here in North America. And so you can look at the evolution of insects and follow their adaptive radiation and major evolution speciation events by following the speciation of flowering plants, which now dominate the land environment. Another group of organisms that benefited from this last one are reptiles. So lizards in particular are insectivores. So lizards also have a huge adaptive radiation event where they become a bunch of new species as they follow the insects into the evolution of plants. So they're eating the insects and diversifying as the insects diversify as they follow flowering plants during their adaptive radiation.